Hi everyone, thank you for coming to today's Times Talk. As you guys may know, this is part of our Civic Engagement Week, so we're really excited to host this and to have Dr. Levy present. Dr. Levy works in the social work department, and she's going to be talking about domestic terrorism and the role of first responders. So thank you, Dr. Levy, for being here today.
Hi. Okay. Before I start, I want to give you a little bit of background on myself. I have dual citizenship, besides the United States, also in Israel. And I worked, social workers in Israel during war and terrorism, but mainly during war, are responsible for the civilian population. So during wars, during the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and the Gulf War, I was a responder. The last, during the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein, he sent missiles only at night, but you never know. And I was attached to a hospital at the time. I also worked as part of the hospital staff during a terrorist attack and got called in at 2 a.m. in the morning, and I didn't live in the same town as the hospital. And I asked the nurse, where did it happen? And she said, oh, I think somewhere around the hospital. So as I was driving 40 minutes to the hospital, I was trying to figure out how to get down on the floor of the car and still drive, just in case they would drive by, the terrorists. You have crazy thoughts during that time. I've been teaching for the last 20 years, 18 here, and have done, because I've had the personal experiences that I've had and dealt with survivors, I have made it one of my areas of research and expertise and have presented and published on terrorism, including a biography on Osama bin Laden. As a social worker, I could do it like a case study on his life and what motivated him and drove him to do what he did, and he was very successful, actually. So one of the things that has concerned me is I was part of a team to go up to Fort Riley to build in a module for pre-deployment for soldiers about how to build their resiliency. These soldiers had deployed several times. We're already, at that time, several years ago, our military was saying that our soldiers did not have post-traumatic stress. And of course that wasn't true, because in talking with the officers there and my own experiences in Israel, it's not a matter of whether you have post-traumatic stress if you've faced in war and terror, violence. It's a matter to what degree you have it and to what degree you can function with it. And so I became concerned here because the population, the public here is not very well, from my point of view, is not very well prepared or prepared and really knows what to do and where to go, etc., and how to deal with the issues that terrorism brings. And a lot of this decision making is made at the upper levels, and I have taught off campus a few courses on domestic terrorism to military. So this has been a concern of mine about how to link working with survivors and understanding terrorism to response. Because I believe that responders also need a background not only in what terrorism is about and the actual attacks, but also about issues of resiliency, not only for people who are responding, but who have to deal with issues of resiliency while they're responding and pre and post, but also for the survivors that they can't care for, because oftentimes those survivors are then handed off to mental health services, and a lot of people wouldn't step foot in a mental health services setting unless they actually had to, particularly if they never had to before. So I'm kind of going step by step to kind of educate, and a lot of this you probably already know, but kind of educate you from a holistic angle. So first of all, these are just visual pictures. We all know that that's 9/11. And the curious thing was, that was my first year teaching here. And one of the students said to me, I did something in the classroom that some students got very upset with when it came up on the screen. We turned on the TV in the classroom, and I wouldn't let them out. I continued class. And the reason was that in Israel, if you are attacked, you just go on. And a student from that year just recently came into contact with me and said, I remember what you did during the classroom, and I really think you did the right thing. Now that's very nice, but there were students who were upset about that too. And after class, one of the students said to me, well, I guess you're used to it. And I said, no, I don't think so. I don't think you ever get used to these situations. Now let's see if I got this right. He showed me what was front and back. I mean, what was forward and reverse. Okay, so here we have a few more pictures of responders who undoubtedly are heroic in that they're very, very committed, and not only to save lives, but to form a measure or feeling of safety during the time that the incident is going on. And as we all know, with 9/11 and other attacks that have been, responders have vicarious trauma and effects, if not illness, as they developed after 9/11 from the toxic chemicals that were released afterwards. Here we have survivors. This is a situation that nobody really ever teaches you to be able to cope with. It's one of those things that you grow up with, and nobody tells you how to do this. Now, in Israel, when we have war or a terrorist attack, it's a small country. Almost everybody around you has been in the military, including the women. So everyone knows what to do. Then the other issue is that it's a very communal society. So everybody actually knows everybody else's business also, but they will come and check on you, etc. Whereas here in Hayes, I really don't know my neighbors very well, and I'm not sure they really want to know me. So it's a different mentality. It's a different worldview. But we have to be trained, and we have to be sensitized to all of the aspects that are involved with this issue. So I wanted to talk about first, as a frame, about resiliency. Most of this content comes from an older writer who has passed away, Viktor Frankl. He wrote a book, which you can probably get for 70 cents on Amazon, called Man's Search for Meaning. And I also have in my family and worked with, I haven't had in my family people who were Holocaust victims with the Nazis who were put into concentration camps. And then in Israel, I worked with people who were Holocaust survivors. And some were able to pick up their lives and continue on and built second families, got married again, had second families, and others never really recovered and were deeply affected as not just with the word survivor, but with the word victim. So this issue of resiliency is one that comes up in social work a lot. Anybody who's in counseling or services deals with issues of resiliency. And what Frankl has said, the first quote is a quote from somebody who was in a concentration camp. Actually, the person who wrote this, more powerful than fate is the courage that bears it, is actually a person who committed suicide in the camp. But he saw this as he was a psychologist before he went in, before he was taken, Viktor Frankl. And what he did was, if there were people who came into the camps, besides the torture and the hardship, etc., there were people who just laid down to die. And one of the things that he did as a psychologist was that he would go around during the time he wasn't out working in the snow with no shoes, etc. He would go around and try to give or remind people of their own individual purpose. And he went to one guy who was laying on, they have these wood tiers, and they have them stacked like firewood. And he said to this guy had laid down to die, and the guy said, he went to him and he said, well, this is in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. I don't have anything to live for anymore. And Viktor said to him, well, what were the things that gave you a sense of meaningfulness? What were your sources of meaningfulness before all of this happened? And as the man began to talk about his memories, we're mind, body, spirit, chemically, emotionally, physically, you could see that it's not the story as much as he began to have feelings of empowerment. And I've had this similar situation. I worked with terminally and chronically ill in general hospitals for many years. And as the person begins to feel empowered, it kind of distances themselves from what is happening. And it makes you realize that the one thing that people cannot touch, or that situations cannot touch really, is your spirit, is whatever you call that. Okay? So he talked about also that humor is one of those things. I do it in the classroom a lot. I tell a lot of jokes. I tell the students on the first day, I'm going to tell a lot of jokes, and if you don't understand, I'll tell you it was a joke. So, and the reason why is that humor gives you distance. It distances you from what is happening. And then, of course, some people transcend themselves, the situation, and they become very heroic. They do things that they never thought they could do, never thought of doing, but they cope. Some way or other, they find coping strategies to take them above and beyond the situation that is happening. And then what is your attitude towards suffering? And I was telling you that in Israel, there was a study done, and I'm going to show you the model of people who went through the Holocaust, through concentration camps, who somehow pulled it together, came to Israel, and then it was very hard. You have to know the history on Israel, but it was not easy to get to Israel in the early years. Or there were those who sat in depression and were not able, had real difficulty beginning life again. So what we need to be aware of when we're responders and when we are intervening with these people back here in the shelters and the survivors is that each person has their unique sense of humanness, their own unique sense of who they are. And we have a habit during trauma, during terror or attacks, of following procedures. We're very Western European in that way. We have everything. If you follow these steps, you'll get from A, B, to C, to D, and you'll have your outcome. But people are not outcomes. People are not unidimensional. And so, as a result, we have to understand what the issues are of resiliency. And also, when there's a terror attack, for instance, in the nightclub in Orlando that took place, or if there was a terror attack in Hayes, you have to take into consideration the differentness in culture, population, and geographical region. But you have to be sensitized to the issue, and I hate to say it because everybody's tired of hearing this word, diversity. But you have to be able to use yourself, if you're a responder, to be able to connect to the person or people or population that you're saving. We know that in Hurricane Katrina, they did a very bad job at the beginning. But part of that was in terms of connecting to the people. But part of that was because of the negative historical legacy that New Orleans had been a part of. And I won't go more into that. I did sabbatical down there. Okay. Well, formally, we have a national response framework, the NRF, that FEMA and other agencies follow. And it's, you know, there are a lot of acronyms with the government. So they decide they're going to use an overarching framework that would include all hazards approach. In other words, anything that might happen. And it's from the federal all the way down to the community. Excuse me. What's interesting about this approach, this document, and FEMA's policies, and Homeland Security, etc., is that they have finally come to the recognition of taking an all-community approach. They finally recognize that the people on the ground are the people in the community who probably will know best and be the best organized, hopefully, to intervene with the people that they know in their communities. In other words, what's interesting about this is we have a hierarchical structure that is supported by a grassroots ideological base. And grassroots is kind of unusual. This is a new approach, so to speak. But I said that I'm not an expert on the government. But when I was teaching military, who were in all kinds of responder roles, all of which depended upon clearance, having security clearance. One of the things that came out in their discussions was that when they intervene down to the local level, that oftentimes local and state levels don't have the clearance in terms of terror attacks. I'm not talking about disasters, natural disasters. I'm talking about terror attacks. That oftentimes information doesn't get shared all the way down the line because not every level has the same security clearance. And that can be an issue when it comes to response from the ground up. It will depend upon the people who are coordinating and in charge. If the incident commanders, in most cases, in a terror attack, is from the FBI. So, in terms of, are they authoritarian or are they more horizontal in terms of delegation, etc., and recognition of the local and state agencies and the NGOs? I mean, it's like if you have a terror attack, you'll contact like the Red Cross, and the Red Cross will come in, but they may be getting survivors, they know how to handle survivors, they may not know the cultural and geographical context, but they also don't know what's going on the ground possibly because of this issue of clearances. And then the other issue is that if you're going to have an effective response, then you need to take into consideration what the factors of resiliency are, not only for individual survivors, but also for that community, in order to help restore them. So, in other words, to respond, but in a way that is the most effective and least damaging, that will help them somehow regain their equilibrium, if at all possible. And I'm not saying that they don't in every case, but I'm saying there certainly could be more work on this. So why don't we look at the reality? I have I have a full report, actually from when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated as the first labeled terrorist attack. But I was looking at stats. I could have done it further back. But what's the reality? I had students say to me, well, they must not be doing a very good job, Homeland Security, FBI, whatever. They must not be doing a very good job because, look, we're still having attacks. But I think what people don't realize is that many, many attacks are not made public to us. The upper agencies do know. But see, what we see is from November of 2005 to 2018, they had 59 terrorist attacks. I didn't count, I could have, I didn't want to put it up, the number of people who died, okay? And then what they did was they counted actual attacks, thwarted attacks, and what's interesting is that they included they labeled school shootings and residential and mall shootings, for example, shootings in restaurants and sniper attacks as criminal incidents. They didn't label them as terror. They labeled them as criminal. And this is one of the questions that's still being debated, that if somebody, God forbid, came into the library and started shooting, is that terror or is it criminal? How will that, it depends, because if it's terror, it's a different legal response than if it's criminal, okay? And the consequences are different if they catch the shooter or shooters or whatever. Now here's the one, they also labeled I'm sorry, I'm holding on to my Kleenex. They label, if it's from a left-wing group, a left-wing extremist group, a right-wing extremist group, Islamic. Now, the Islamic is also an extended story, because FBI and Homeland Security, although they're domestically centered in the United States, they have to go abroad if they find out that these people were connected to international terror organizations. So they are coordinating there too. Our biggest problem, as the students that I was teaching talked about, is trying to keep track of the lone wolf attacks. People who have some kind of, think they have some radical ideology or whatever, like bombing an abortion clinic. Timothy McVeigh and Nicholson, who bombed the Oklahoma City building. It's really hard to know when, where, and how, and who lone wolf attacks will occur. And that's one of the hardest for the formal agencies to identify and follow up on. But we also need to understand what is happening with terrorists who are coming from their different radicalizations for whatever their belief systems are. Okay? So we have a definition. It's a strategy. This is from Albert Bandura. And Albert Bandura was a psychiatrist, psychologist, and you see that the reference is a little old. By the way, they're classic. He wrote a chapter in an anthology that I took notes from. It's a strategy of violence designed, I'm going to sit down for a minute, folks, designed to promote desired outcomes by installing fear in the public at large. So we're talking about power and the uses of power in order to force people to come to victimize them and show how powerful you are over them. An alternative definition is that we have terrorists who have ideological, not just, by the way, most of the, I can't cite statistic here, but most of the terrorists who are religiously motivated and in some respects ideologically motivated are not mentally ill. They're not mental health problems, if you can understand that. These are people who can walk down the street or whatever, but if they buy into this belief system, then that gives them the idea that they can go ahead and do this, that they have to do this. They will. It's not that they're mentally ill or mentally imbalanced. In fact, many of these people are very intelligent. Some are stupid because they catch them. But no, really. But the psychology behind this is that when you go in to attack another person, and we know this about, I won't go into it, but we know this about domestic violence, by the way. We know that there is a point in which the perpetrator, or group of perpetrators, disengage from their victims. And that psychological process means that at the point of disengagement, whatever their belief system is, it gives them sanction to go ahead and do it. So in other words, if a person came in here from one of these terror groups and has this in his mind, you are no longer people but pieces of furniture that whatever. So, and it's the disengagement. When they disengage, they basically blame the victims that it's their own fault that they're being victimized. It's, you know, it's really twisted thinking. And terrorism, by definition, you know, if you send in a bunch of mediators and negotiators or whatever, it may not work because, particularly if they are ideological radicals, whatever, because they're not looking for a peaceful means of ending the situation, right? They're making their mark. So responders, when they go in and they coordinate together, they need to understand the mentality of the people, of the perpetrators that they're dealing with. By the way, if I go over time, you have to tell me. I want to read you something. I told you that I did an God forbid, a biography on Osama bin Laden. This is a conversation, a transcript of a conversation he had with his son. Okay? His son was a child at the time. Omar bin Laden had asked, why not attack Israel? Because you have to realize Israel's in a similar situation. Before America, given that Israel was a small country near to us, while America was a huge country far away from our shores. One wheel is made of steel, and the other wheel is made of wood. Now, son, if you wanted to destroy the bicycle, would you destroy the wooden or the steel wheel? You're all thinking about that. The wooden wheel, of course, I replied. You are correct, my son. Remember this. America and Israel are one bicycle with two wheels. The wooden wheel represents the United States. The steel wheel represents Israel. Omar, Israel is the stronger power of the two. But does a general attack the strongest line when in battle? No. He concentrates on the weakest part of the line. The Americans are weak. It is best to attack the weakest point first. Once we take out the wooden wheel, the steel wheel will automatically fall. Who can ride a bicycle with only one wheel? This is total commitment. Ideological, whatever belief system, commitment. And he said, first we obliterate America. By that I don't mean militarily. We can destroy America from within by making it economically weak until its markets collapse. And he goes on. So when you're dealing with terrorists, then you know that this is probably, in most cases, a truer statement, that it disallows for a peaceful conclusion. All right? Next slide. So what are the moral and psychological factors of imminent threat for survivors? First of all, if you're in the middle of a crisis, you are going psychologically through an appraisal of what's happening. And in a terror attack, you want to survive. I mean, that's the issue. You want to survive, and you need to be rescued. And first you try to see, you go through all of your coping mechanisms in one instant, trying to think about what you can do and where you can go, or what you can do. So one of the hardest things for a terror victim is trying to understand why the hell somebody would want to attack you. You're innocent. But terrorists use innocence as a weapon. So somehow or other, you have to figure out how to appraise this experience that one you're going through, and then later, how are you going to interpret that? So an Israeli neurosurgeon and neurologist, psychologist at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem came up with stress theory versus trauma theory. Stress theory is based on the concept of how much, if you had a bone, right? I broke my bone, my arm. I'm such a klutz. But I broke my arm, my mother was right. That was a joke. Okay, I fell on my arm and I broke my arm, okay? So the question is, if you have a bone, is how much pressure can you put on it? And then at what point in the long term will it remain with a fracture, a scar, an emotional, psychological? You know, your body doesn't feel like it's in balance when you go through a trauma. The homeostatic balance needs to be restored. Now, what happens is the terrorist's aim is to make you feel the fear, control you through fear, subjugate you. If you look at dictatorships, those are good examples. And what Frankl says is that they want to drive you into, although he isn't referring directly to terrorism, I applied it, an existential vacuum, which is that you feel helpless, you lose your sense of purpose, and suddenly nothing has any meaning for you. You look like you know.
Well, I'm thinking of Eric Fromm and Escape from Freedom, because that vacuum is created and the state provides you with that purpose.
Right. And that situation, those outcomes are what the terrorists are looking for. So Osama bin Laden talks about doing away with the wooden wheel. Okay. Now I want to talk to you about a model of hope. This is another Israeli who was originally an American who migrated to Israel, sociologist. His name is Aaron Antonovsky, and he got very curious about this question of coping with trauma and resiliency. I told you that there were many Holocaust survivors who came to Israel who were able to pick up and keep going, but nobody heard from them. And you'll find this a lot of times, that in major traumas, another story that I heard, or that I read about that was researched, was that Japanese people who were interned into the camps during World War II, when they came out of the camps, they didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to continue on. So he wanted to know about the people who continued on. We didn't want to look at just people who were having psychiatric, psychological problems that were continuing. So he built a model based on 3 areas, and he said that these areas are not separate, that they're interlocking. I'm going to show you a visual picture pretty soon. One is that when you're confronted with a traumatic situation, the first thing is you want to make sense of what is happening. What is your understanding of what is happening at that moment? Second of all, what is your understanding of your capability to manage your understanding of what's happening? And third, what kinds of attached meanings do you put to what is happening that you've internalized? Okay? I had a student once who came to me. She had a really bad situation, traumatic situation with her gynecologist, believe it or not, who basically harassed her and may have hurt her. And she walked into my office and she said, if it's going to happen to anybody, it's going to happen to me. Why? People do not suddenly get created in the moment. They bring themselves into the story of what has happened to them. So in other words, if I'm working with a survivor, I'm in one of those immediate shelter places, and it turns out you don't do a psychiatric or whatever assessment at that time. But it turns out that this is a person who over their lifetime before this happened experienced abuse. They found out, there was a RAND report some time ago about who in the military was most vulnerable to PTSD. They came up with 3 groups. One was women. What else is new? 2, feminism hadn't hit the charts at that time. 2 was minorities. Why? Because minorities have to if they're in a situation that it may be conflictual, where they think they're being judged, they have to figure out whether it's because they're a minority or because that's the way it is. In other words, is it objective or subjective? And the third were people who were in the military who had come from backgrounds where they had experienced abuse as children growing up. Why? Because abuse imprints itself on your skin, it's mind, body, spirit. So there are triggers. Okay, we know that in psychology. I added 2 more components to his model. One is the cultural, I used to work for an Indian tribe, if you can believe this. I was a tribal employee. For 5.5 years, they kept wondering if I was really Native American. Of course, I wasn't. I was a Jew who was working with the Indians. But that was a joke. Okay, so, and the other is because of cultural context, you're going to have a spiritual context, okay? And it depends what your belief systems are. Here's a visual. Okay? So what you have is comprehensibility, manageability. Then I added the spiritual and the cultural. But Antonovsky says the most important factor of these interacting changes or interacting elements is the issue of what attached meanings you give to the situation that's happening to you, which has to do with your internalization of how you see yourself, what's happened to you, and the reasons how you've interpreted things have happened to you. I worked in an elder day center in Israel, and there was one woman there. I would go up to her, good social worker, and I would go up and say, you know, how are you doing today? How are you feeling? What can you tell me? She said, oh, you don't know how much I suffered. And she couldn't get past that one statement. She didn't have Alzheimer's or anything. She said, you just don't know. And that was her identification. That was how she interpreted the things that had happened to her. Other people, their orientation is different. So my vision is that people who are that in social work and people who work for the Red Cross, they are as much responders as anyone else. Okay? And I've called this because the government says we should take a whole community approach. Okay? So what I foresee is a 24-hour walk-in center. You don't psychologize survivors. You don't go up and say, how are you feeling today? No. What you do is you bring them coffee, you make them a safety first. You make them a safe environment is first, okay? And then you kind of non-verbally let them know that you're there if they want company or they want somebody to sit with them. And if they want to talk, that they can. Now, in other words, we always talk, one of the issues in terror attacks is we run in, we clear the building, and then we take care of the people who are wounded. Well, we've had people who have been wounded in terror attacks who couldn't wait 2 to 3 hours for a medical triage. On the other hand, the people who are clearing the building don't want medical people hurt. So it's kind of a balance. What I'm talking about here is a psychological triage with the medical, okay? Because people who are survivors may also have medical problems that were pre the attack, all right? So you have a team approach there, but with a base on the psychological triage, because we don't want to be unidimensional and say, well, they didn't get hurt physically, you know, and then when they stabilize, we're sending them home. The question is, what is stabilization? And what condition will they be by the time they go home to continue life? Okay, and I put in here also the issue of the technology that you need. Well, I don't know if anybody uses fax anymore, but you know, I'm not quite up to date. I'm still technologically challenged, as you saw. Did away with my whole presentation here. And all of this is intertwined. When they worked in the hospital and we had the terrorist attack, basically what happens is they number people as they come through, such that as they come through the ER up to the internal medicine, we shift them to other wards, and we don't have a whole bunch of people running after them, right? But one of the hardest things I ever had was with the terrorist attack was trying to deal when I went into the lobby and said they saw a social worker was trying to deal with the friends and family who were just in absolute hysteria. And at the time, we didn't have a center like this. But I think that this might be a workable setting to create and to identify the people who are in that center as responders. The other thing is this, that after it's all over, how much follow-up is done? Now in Israel, when a soldier gets hurt or killed, the Ministry of Defense immediately sends out social workers or psychologists or whatever to the homes. And they follow up on that family and person often for years. There's no cutoff. It's not at one point they're survivors and at the next point they're mental health cases. Okay? Is that kind of clear? All right. So this is just a proposed kind of thing. So one of the things you don't do when you're a responder, this kind of responders, you don't label them and you don't pathologize the behaviors. You listen, don't be overly helpful. Don't debrief. We don't do debriefing anymore. Because if somebody keeps repeating, they also found this out in the military, they don't use the concept of debrief. Is because if you go over what happened, you might become re-traumatized, is the problem. Okay? Now, another Israeli, his name is Aryeh Shalev, said, don't be surprised if the survivors, when they tell their story more than once, that the story changes. And one of the reasons it changes is that with each retelling, they begin to create a psychological distance from the actual event that they went through internally, right? We're talking about resiliency here, right? Self-detachment. So it's not that they're lying or they're making up or anything like that. It's just the issue of processing what has happened to them. What has happened to them. I'm going to go on. I have a feeling I'm running out of time. And this is the last slide. In a small town like Hayes, and some of the small towns we have in Kansas, if God forbid, we don't think that it would happen in a small town, but if it should happen, we need to also be paying attention for the psychological triaging. We also need to be paying attention to the community's resilience. So, and we need to provide those kinds of resources. So that's why I've got the picture up there about the empowerment zone. Are there any questions? Or did I just kind of put y'all on the floor? No. Anyone? Yeah.
Well, I like the idea as far as empowerment goes, but the biggest thing I think is to be prepared in life so that you can get up. If you get knocked down, you've got to go forward and keep on keeping on.
Well, different people are raised differently, and they've been socialized differently as to how to deal with hardship. I've heard from students here that you have to be self-sufficient and suck it up. Okay? Now, I'm not generalizing to everybody. But how do that has its interpretation, internal identity, whatever, and if you're a responder, in terms of telling your story, maybe you won't. And then gender issues, of course, enter into this. If you're, how you see yourself in terms of being a male survivor as opposed to a female survivor. What's allowed and what's not allowed. I mean, in terms of emotional expression or even verbal expression. So what we should do, what I always say is whenever you use the word should, replace it with the word can. Because you know what you can do and you know what you cannot do. Should is like this hammer up there that comes down, bangs you on the head, and then you're supposed to feel guilt or whatever. Okay? But our parents raise us to know what we should do. But with survivors, we have to be really sensitive, and we don't want to increase their feelings of suffering, and we want to help them in terms of reigniting and re-identifying their sources of meaningfulness. What are those things? What are those things that they can go on to continue their living? Yes, sir.
There are some big names in the field like Judith Herman who have written extensively on the overlap of trauma between trauma and war and terrorism and domestic and sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
And almost all the same things, the giving meaning, empowerment, or the same way that we treat survivors of sexual and domestic assault and things like those ideas that you should just have to suck it up or that you could just ignore it are one of the big barriers that we face in getting people effective treatment.
Yeah. What you need to do with effective training is that your team, the other thing I didn't put up here is that I'm going to come back to this, is that when you are doing training or establishing policies, you need to have the people who were the most affected as part of that process for future preparation. And we often don't have that. So a comment like that, I mean, not about Judith Herman, I've heard of her. These guys were early, the guys I put up here, they were early. But this issue about meaningfulness and discussing with the community what are the sources of meaningfulness for us and how do we rebuild from what happened and how do we help each other from what happened in ways that will be acceptable, because people are very privacy conscious and they're also very worried about labels. So I think you're right, but it's the manner in which you go about it. Yes, sir.
The empowerment zone it's good in thought, but in this country, at least in this country, because you kept going back to Israel, because it repeats itself over and over again. Mm-hmm. We are a nation of forgetters. I mean, unless you've been directly affected, family, friend, what have you, after about 48 hours, 72 hours, a week, 2 weeks, it just kind of fades away until the next one happens. I mean, you don't, just like with the Las Vegas shooting, what's that been, 2 years? And that was a domestic terror attack.
And it was a lone wolf attack, right?
But it was still an attack. And the first couple of weeks, that's all everybody talked about. Oh, the people in Las Vegas or the people in Orlando. But we don't do the follow-up. Like you said, in Israel, they follow up for years and years. On average, even 9/11, what was it? Maybe a couple of years, those people started to get forgotten, until it was a 1-year anniversary or 2-year anniversary. And so until we come to a realization that you have to follow up, you have to stay active and seek out people that were directly affected or indirectly, I don't think we could ever move forward in coming up with, a working plan.
Well, I have to be clear that I understand what you're saying. I have two reactions. One is that if we're a nation of forgetting, in a way, it's a blessing that you can. because in Israel we can't. Okay. But the other thing is, I'm teaching a course right now online called Mass Trauma Intervention. And one of the final assignments to the students is to create, because they're learning a lot of this, to create and investigate what the response plans and the community connections are to the people in the towns where they live. The question is to what extent do people want to be involved? Do they want to take social action? Do you prepare, or do you wait till it happens? The reason I showed the statistics is, and they're totally from Lincoln's assassination, I counted 365 incidents or thwarted incidents. It's probably not going to stop. So I agree with you, sir, that it should be part of our reality, but on the other hand, we have to be constructive about it, and we can't live in fear. And then we also have a mentality where you don't have to be involved if you don't want to be. We're not, I can't say that. There are some societies that are more communally oriented rather than individualistically oriented. So it depends what the cultural background is for that too. Okay. Well, thank you all for helping me. And thanks for the tech support.